I have been looking forward to this occasion. The Reverend Dr. Charlene Han Powell. I asked her a couple months ago to be a part of this conversation. I'm grateful that she said yes, and she's here tonight. Uh, Dr. Han Powell and Charlene, you have to tell me if I call you Dr. Han Powell or Charlene. I forgot.
Charlene,
Okay,
please, Charlene.
good. Well, Charlene is the senior pastor at the First Presbyterian Church of Berkley. We are colleagues in ministry and also colleagues in a specific stage of ministry as well, as we're both new in our calls, having recently moved me halfway across the country, Charlene all the way across the country from New York to Berkeley. She was in New York serving at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church as the executive pastor there. And so we have tried to support each other in these new calls, and grateful to have my friend and colleague in ministry, Charlene, here with us today. So, Charlene, welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you all.
Right. Well, I suggest we get right into it.
All right.
We have all been hunkered down for the last 12 months, and you have recently moved all the way across the country with your family. Tell us, what did you learn about yourself while relocating in the middle of a pandemic?
To provide some context for your community, I moved from New York City, as you said, with my husband and my two kids my two daughters who are 4 and 6. And so moving in the middle of a pandemic, clear across the country, I have learned that I am stronger than I ever knew, and that I am needier than I ever knew. So I think that there have been moments in this transition, I'm not going to lie, where I've been like, why did I do this? Why did I do this now? Why did I do this or more accurately, why, God, have you called me to do this in the middle of a pandemic across the country when schools aren't open? We've been homeschooling our girls and just, basically sheltering in place. And yet in the midst of that, even when things feel so permanent, when the despair feels permanent, I find that the grace is abundant and there's always a new day. And I find myself getting stronger and stronger in the midst of that, which is, you only realize when you're out of it, looking back and be like, oh my gosh, I survived that storm, or I survived that period. But I've also realized that I'm definitely, I need community. I think that is something that we've all realized, but I need people to help me raise my children. My husband and I cannot do that on our own. We need family members. We need teachers. We need people who just love them simply for the fact that they're our children and will come and give them hugs and hang out with them and do puzzles with them. I need to eat dinner with human beings and not on Zoom. And so, I know that this is a reality that we're all in the middle of, but there are no outlets. So whatever frustrations or stress or anger or anxiety that I've been dealing with in the midst of a pandemic, normally that would be followed by lunch with a friend or a walk around the block with a family member or something. And so just without those outlets, I've kind of realized my capacity, my threshold is quite low. And so all of these things I didn't know were necessary to my survival, I now know what is necessary to my survival. But I also know that I can survive. So it's a bit of a both and. Yeah.
You're from the Bay Area, right?
I am. Yeah.
So what have you discovered upon your return? What has changed? What stayed the same?
So I grew up about 25 minutes from Berkeley, where I serve right now. And when I was in high school, we used to drive to Berkeley and get pizza and hang out. It was a cool place to go shopping and walk around. Coming back, I've realized that it's not realized, I've known this, but definitely seeing this firsthand, the growing housing crisis in California. So every time I get off the freeway and drive to the church, or I drive around, I took my girls to the park, there are tents everywhere. People who are living in their tents and then going to work, or kids who are sleeping in tents and then going to school. That was homelessness has always been a huge issue in California, but it's definitely something that's growing with housing costs just rising and rising and rising. And so that's something that's changed a lot. And like any city, just the turnover of small businesses, local businesses is insane. I imagine at this point, I've been here since October. I can't even count how many restaurants have already gone out of business in that short time, right? And so it is a city that's constantly changing before my eyes. Yeah.
In San Francisco, which is right across the bay from you,
Yep.
the school board recently voted 6-1 to rename 44 schools that were named after people who were either racist or misogynistic, or whose actions led to genocide. George Washington, for owning slaves. Abraham Lincoln forced policies towards Native Americans. They were two of the names that were stripped from San Francisco schools. And my question is, what do you make of grand gestures like this one?
So I think gestures in general, grand or small, are important. And I know that we're seeing this across the board, whether it's with taking down monuments, but in this particular example you're talking about schools, right? So what does it say to our children is the question I think that immediately comes to my mind. These grand gestures, right? So they say something to our children, which I think is extremely important. They give us the opportunity to say what we are for and what we are against. And for the parents of children whose schools, the names have changed, they get to say, this is why. This is why it's important. And this is why we learn from history and from our mistakes. And so I think grand gestures give us the opportunity to state what is important, and have those really crucial conversations, if you will, with our children. They are only a small part of the process. And so it is interesting that San Francisco has done this, has changed so many. The irony is that for, I would say, almost 80%, or maybe more than 80% of the kids in public schools in San Francisco are children of color. And so in the midst of this all, you still have a school system that is remote. And so you have a lot of kids who are struggling to get access to hot lunches and breakfast and resources in school. And so there's been backlash around having this be a very convenient grand gesture in the midst of so much need. And that's not at all taking away from the teachers' desire to be safe and safe opening and just the growing situation in California. But it is not enough just to change the paint on the outside of the building. We have to change what's going on inside of the building. Policies have to be enacted, systems have to change. More importantly, especially in regards to these conversations around, figures like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And some of these schools' names were changed for actually erroneous reasons. And so it's just been like this very intense process of figuring out why this person and not this person. But it gives us the opportunity to ask the question, how, for the sins that these individuals are being held accountable, how are they still alive in our systems today? Where are the insidious roots of what we are fighting against? And how are we addressing them in the present day, in our current context?
Right.
Especially for children, it's kind of like teaching your kids in class not to steal, but then they come to school the next day and you take their lunch from them without asking. Like, we can't just front with these values that we say are important if we're not following up with action ourselves. Look, I'm not going to say we don't do grand gestures. I'm saying we can never do them alone. Like, there better be a whole lot of legislation and curriculum auditing and all that kind of stuff that follows behind these surface level changes.
Right. San Francisco is a very progressive city, and right. I mean, that's one thing I've noticed in the last 12 months is how often progressives, especially, right, like the most liberal people I know, can be focused on transforming, like making the wrong kind of changes, right? Can get emotional and heated about particular changes but when it comes time to like sacrifice, their own comfort or potentially a spot in school for their own kid, or it oftentimes becomes difficult for people like to follow through. So I have been paying close attention to this San Francisco thing, just trying to figure out, like, understand what's going on there. What does that mean? Right now, we're changing the names of schools.
Right. I mean,
And
did you read that article in the New York Times
oh
on this?
yeah, I read it.
Okay.
Yeah. I've read all.
Yeah, if that's where you're getting your news on this, I think it's interesting. Ezra Klein kind of called out Californians. He said that we are symbolically liberal and operationally conservative.
Right.
And I think this pandemic has forced a lot of us across the aisle, across the spectrum, to pony up with what we say is important. But I mean, this has definitely been an issue, a prolonged issue in California, especially around housing. I mean, pre-pandemic around housing and where we put shelters, for example, where we build multifamily housing units, and the city or town boards that will pass them, and what it does to their individual property value is a huge question that comes up. So you're exactly right. I mean, the second it hits your home, your wallet, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People are allies up until the point, right, where allyship is requested while they're in their own home. And I don't say that for everyone. That's certainly not the case. Those kind of generalizations are oftentimes not helpful, but sometimes generalizations are helpful for getting to like the heart of the matter. Well, let's talk. You're a second generation Korean immigrant. I'm an immigrant as well. And we have shared many conversations around our own experiences in growing up in homes where new to America. How did your parents talk to you about being an Asian in America?
So the short answer is that they didn't, not explicitly. I mean, all of these conversations that we're having right now, I remember back in June, sitting down with my girls and explaining to them what it means for them to be biracial. I never had that conversation with my parents growing up. I was born in California. They immigrated in their adult lives. And so they were still processing, I think, for themselves what it meant to be an immigrant, to survive. I mean, so it wasn't. So how old again when you?
I was 3 when we came. Right. And I don't like your parent. I mean, like my parents, there was no how to be an immigrant in America class that anybody was offering. Right.
Right.
You figure it out on the fly while you're trying to pay bills and do all that other stuff. So
my mother learned English while she was doing her medical residency. So my mom, rock star that she is a pathologist. She learned English in Ohio while she was doing her medical residency. I mean, like, the thought of doing that just blows my mind. And so I think for her and my father, they were figuring out what it meant to be an Asian American. Now they were newly American. I don't even know at what point they would have defined themselves as American, as opposed to just Korean, right? Because they spent their formative years in Korea. I think it was a process of them trying to assimilate themselves, trying to survive, and just my dad had a small business, trying to just keep that business afloat. And they wanted, the whole point for them to come to the United States was to afford us with opportunities. And so they wanted us to assimilate. And so identity wasn't a huge conversation. And I know this sounds kind of crazy, but I don't think it was a luxury that they felt like they could afford back then, was to sit down and say, this is how you get to be Korean on your terms. And this is when you aren't Korean. I mean, I remember being a child and bringing Korean food in my lunchbox and being made fun of. Right. And then coming home and being like, Mom, you can't pack me that anymore. The kids said that it smelled weird. And it's not like she knew, she never went to elementary school in the United States.
Right.
And I mean, I genuinely believe for them, their most important thing was that we succeed to the best of our ability. That again, that was the opportunity. They traveled so far. They went through so much to give their children.
Right.
And I think racial identity is something that is
secondary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that time. Yeah.
At that time. Yeah. It's like, it's actually, I mean, it just me asking that question assumes, so much, right?
Did your parents talk to you about being Ethiopian American?
No, not at all. Not one time. I mean, there was this idea of identity just wasn't really, we didn't talk about that. Either it was assumed or I think it was just assumed that you are who you are. Like in our home, we were, my parents spoke our tribal tongue. In our home, we when we could afford it, we ate Ethiopian food, Culturally, I was raised within my own home as an Ethiopian, not just as an Ethiopian, but as an Oromo, right? So even from like the people from our tribe. So, but this question of like sitting around, like wondering, like, who am I? That to have the time, as you just said, to have the time to ask yourself that question while you're attempting to give, to support a family, to raise children, secure their future as best you can.
Right.
I think my dad would laugh at me if I said, what was your identity in 1984, right? When we first, did you identify as an American, as an Ethiopian?
Right.
How did you reconcile those identities? He'd be like, no, I mean, our only identity was our children and making sure they had an education. That was it.
So looking back, I'm realizing that the one distinct place that I felt like there was, it was the, I guess for lack of a better word, the promotion of the Korean culture was at church. And so we went to an immigrant community church, and which is an interesting concept because I think there is this very important ideal of diversity in the church, right? You really want to have that's something that First Pres Berkley strives to have, is be a multicultural church for the reason that we want to honor all cultures and welcome all cultures and celebrate all of them. But I don't know, I look back and I'm like, if I didn't have that singular Korean community every Sunday, I wouldn't have had as strong of a knowledge about Korean culture, because that was a huge vehicle, but it stands over and against a lot of what the church is trying to do today, which is very interesting.
Right. I mean, the church would be your refuge, right? A place where you could kind of escape from this constant, from the struggle of not the struggle of trying to figure out who you are, but the struggle of trying to explain yourself to other people.
The struggle of trying to fit in. Yeah.
Trying to fit in, right? And then you go into these like homogenous cultural settings where you don't have to explain anything.
Nope.
Right?
It's just understood. Yep.
And it's precious. And I think, that's in the PCUSA, we've been trying to be diverse for as long as, we have been a denomination since the early we came together, right? And with reunification, as diversity was sort of like, that was the part of the purpose to be a diverse church. But if you talk to people, for instance, who worship in primarily Black churches, they're like, don't take this from us.
Right.
Don't expect us to give this up.
Yeah.
To come for the benefit of a more diverse congregational setting,
Right.
So as a pastor in Berkeley, how is your church at this point working through this season of like national reckoning, right? That we've had where all of a sudden we're all talking about racial identity, racial injustice, issues of equity, equality. Can you tell us some of the stories about how your church has been hosting and handling and nurturing the work that individuals have been doing?
Yeah. I wanted to say with fear and trembling, and also with a really, really healthy dose of humility. When George Floyd was murdered, I was interviewing with the PNC, and I was just kind of keeping an eye on what First Pres Berkeley was doing in the midst of this. And something that struck me was that it wasn't something that was named in worship. That was a big thing that was happening in churches, is who was saying it in worship right after it happened, who was being current. And I know that at Fifth Ave, we pre-recorded, right? And so a lot of things, I mean, it was just a scramble
Right.
of who was on the right side of things in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing an email written by the pastors that copped to it and said sorry. And I was like, okay, like, we're not going to get it perfect. We're not going to get it right, but we are going to have the humanity and the humility to say, oh, we kind of missed the mark on that one. And since then, I mean, actually for years now, First Pres Berkeley has had a racial justice committee that long precedes this most recent wave of racial reckoning. That's been faithfully meeting and discussing and working through kind of their own journey and their own reflections as being people of color within this church. And they're providing great insight and a way forward for the church to not just talk about it. Because I think the first thing that I saw across the board, because again, in the spiritual scramble that was happening, was that everyone was like, okay, what book study are you doing? Right? It was just like, it was just across the board. Yeah. What book are you all reading? And then the real question, it's like, changing the names of the school is like, okay, so then what? Because it's important to have those moments of gathering as a community and saying really hard things and confessing things and admitting things, and also just saying, honestly, here's been my journey, is what's going to happen next, right? And so I think we're very much in the phase of that, of saying, okay, so we know what we're against, right? On a large scale. So what are we going to be about? What are we going to be for? How are we going to be for promoting justice and equality? And fortunately for us, the opportunities are infinite right outside our front door. Fortunately, in the sense of a sense of mission, not fortunately in the sense of just the vast need that exists in our neighborhood. I mean, but that's something that you said to our community when you were with us. You said, it's right outside your front door. It's in your schools. It's around the block. I think that's what we're figuring out, is how to invest in our neighborhood.
Right. And it's such a slow process. We're Americans. And so we build bridges, like literally I'm now from Texas, and we construct things here. I mean, we can build it. If you can imagine it, we will build it here. Yeah. This is so different. It's like no amount of money or focus or engineering or planning or programming is getting will get us there. And I think we're just now figuring it out.
Yeah.
There's no office of the whatever at the General Assembly that we can create to do the heart work that's necessary for the church to be a partner of integrity in these communal conversations that were happening, because they're not just happening in the church.
Right.
I mean, skeptics and seekers and atheists and agnostics and people from all faith traditions are having the exact same conversation that the church is. So we don't have a monopoly on this.
No, we do not.
Right. Yeah. But there is, and part of what I fear is that we are going to get left behind in this conversation.
Right. And I think I love Presbyterian polity. So I think it's super at its best, it's representational, right?
Right.
But sometimes our desire for across the board consensus or unanimity or unity means that we're looking for the perfect next step, the perfect solution. and we're paralyzed by that mandate or by that goal. And so that's why we're going to be left behind. It's not because there's any less of a desire for the church to be a part of this work, but because our systems, to talk about systems, are built such that time is not a luxury. Right now, time is of the essence, not only for lives and bodies that are being broken in the midst of this, but also in light of the witness, right? That we're saying to exactly across the board, outside of the church, within the church, different generations who are saying, okay, you said this, you did this, so what's next? What follows?
Yeah, we have excelled, we've excelled at social justice. We've done tremendous work. Tall steeple mainline churches, like the two churches that we serve, have claimed social justice work as, part of our mandate and mission. That has become part of our identity, but over and against too often, the transformative work that happens in the heart, the transformation that's necessary within each one of us before we can transform systems.
Conversion.
Let's just say yes. We there is something for us to learn, from people who use that term.
We have limited that term
to crazy.
Salvific belief,
right?
Doctrine and orthodoxy, and it's a lifetime of conversion. It's a lifetime of learning the expansive nature of the gospel, which doesn't just care about our souls. Jesus cared about bodies and minds and hearts and mental health and physical health. And you're preaching on Jesus's healing miracles. If Jesus didn't care about those things, why would he have messed around with that?
I step into this question gingerly, and yet I'm just going to step into it, right? I'll just jump with 2 feet forward and say, your skin is not black and it's not white. We normally talk about white supremacy as it relates to the identity of Black Americans, but I'm curious, how do you experience it?
How do I experience what? Racism?
White supremacy, racism.
White supremacy. So I will be completely honest in that this, for myself as an individual, is a fairly new journey. June of 2020 was just talk about racial awakening. I think I journeyed with some friends on this. I remember just being like, I think I'm mad. I think I'm mad for myself. I think I'm mad for my parents and for my sisters and it was crazy. In complete transparency, you shared this question with me ahead of time, the big ones. And so when you shared it with me, I have never, what did you say? Can we just put it out there?
Oh yeah, 100%. Please put it out there.
What did you say?
Yeah. No, I said your skin is
white.
I said your skin is white. Yes.
Yes.
Right. And then as we're having the Zoom, I saw this visceral reaction, it came through the 2D screen, and I saw it right there. I was like, oh, I just said something.
Yeah.
And it's the worst because you say something and you don't know what you said, that elicited the reaction. So you can't fix it immediately. You don't even know what to take back.
Yeah.
Is it the article, the preposition, the subject, the verb? The punctuation, I'll take it back if I knew what it was. But yeah, that was how we introduced this question.
That's how we stepped into it. Yep.
Right. Yeah.
And I had a visceral reaction mainly because no one's ever said that to me. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, no one's ever said otherwise to me. I've had, my favorite is when I've, said I've experienced racism before, is like, oh, I don't see you that way. I don't see you as other, or I don't see you as another color, right? It's just like, it's like the whole colorblind argument, right? Where it is this kind of racial war, if we're going to call it, has been made this black and white issue. And I think especially in June, I collectively saw, and I mean, thank God for social media in this regard, especially since we've all been distanced, a lot of Asian Americans who were like kind of just starting to speak up, on behalf of our Black siblings and saying, this is just as much our problem. Our silence is violence in this as well. But I think even our own reckoning of our own experience. And so in light of the fact that you shared this question, I was just like, I was sitting with this and I was like, okay, why did I have such a visceral reaction? And I mean, I think part of it is, it's like someone saying, oh, like you telling me matter of factly, you're from Montana. And me being like, no, I've never been to Montana. I am Californian. I pay California taxes. Like, I don't give me the benefit of being from somewhere else when I've never experienced those benefits before. And so I was reading this article because right now there is a huge spike in violence against Asian American Pacific Islander, and particularly elderly Asian Americans. I mean, in New York City, so I was in New York City when the pandemic hit, the country in a big way back in March. And I remember I stopped going on the subway, not because I was afraid of getting COVID, but because I was afraid of being spit on the subway, or being blamed for the virus being in the United States. And I mean, in New York City alone, the hate crime rate against Asian Americans in the past year, so since March, has risen 1,800%. 1,800%, right? And we're seeing that across the country. So, I mean, that's real right there, right? That's the racism. But at the same time, the question of, okay, well, I'm not Black and I'm not white, right? That's kind of the weird liminal space that the model minority has been put in. So I read this quote from an article that was shared on social media because it's just so powerful. And Eric Toda wrote, "The model minority myth placed on Asian Americans through a systemic racist system has made us raceless. That dynamic has resulted in silencing us, even in the greatest moments of appropriation and violence." And so I mean, I think what you touched on, even in just your very innocent remark, is a very real dynamic about what it means to be Asian American. What is the color of our skin? Because we're not Black and we're not white. And so I've been really interested in this rise in hate crime, particularly right in our neighborhood in Oakland and in San Francisco. And one of the things that was shared with me, because one of our members serves in the San Francisco Police Department, is that Asian Americans are less likely to actually report crimes. I mean, the model minority myth is keep your head down and work hard and be successful. Do not draw attention to yourself. And I mean, I think one of the really hard side effects of that is absolutely this kind of weird reality where we've become raceless, unless we're being punished for our presence here, right? With COVID or something. It's a very tenuous, convenient racial identity that is not convenient for us. I think I've experienced my whole life, and I don't even know how. Because again, I think the narrative is keep your head down, work hard. You're the model minority. These are the opportunities and the privileges that have been afforded to you.
What are the opportunities and the privileges?
Success.
Like, you've got that. You've got success. So be happy with it. Keep your head down. But to be erased, I mean, which is what I hear you saying, right? Is to be erased in the sense that you're not given the privilege of suffering out loud. You're not allowed to suffer out loud. And neither are you allowed to find community with oppressors because you're Asian and you're not white in America. So where are you? So like who? But of course, I mean, the categorizations that I just use aren't helpful at all to the conversation whatsoever. And we're so accustomed to breaking down these conflicts like this into, who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. But what I hear you saying is like, we actually are, I'm the one that's in the margins in between.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm reading some of the chats that are coming in, which are beautiful. And one of them just remarked about her admiration for amazing Black female leaders like Stacey Abrams and Amanda Gorman. My goodness, my hero, and other strong, wonderfully strong Black women. And I'll be honest, I have like growing up, I've had deep envy for the strength and courage in which Black women have held their space. Because I do believe it has been celebrated, at least within Black culture. There hasn't been a lot of, I do see it emerging, Amos. Like, that is something that's so exciting to me, is I do see Asian American activists and leaders taking the mic and saying, okay, this is our experience. This is my experience. Like, I imagine if this wave of hate crimes against Asian American Pacific Islanders would have happened 10 years ago, what would the outcry have been like? Because right now we have the medium of social media in which we're able to push these things out and draw attention. And you have wonderful emerging voices that look unlike any voices we've ever seen before in terms of what they're saying and their volume. Not that there have never been Asian American activists in the past, but there's definitely a groundswell of momentum in this direction where you have an entire people saying, no, we're not raceless. We have a very unique racial history and identity within this country, but it wasn't taught to us in school, right? I didn't learn about it in school. And so we are having to go out and learn our history ourselves, which is empowering and also just straight up disappointing that this is not a narrative that is widely known or shared. And so, of course, you are going to have young children grow into young adults and then adults without a very clear picture of the world in which they exist in every single day. And I think I'm a product of that, for sure.
Do you consider yourself an outsider or an insider?
Oh, outsider.
Well, no, I'm saying in the Presbyterian Church.
Outsider.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so funny. It's like, I don't walk around being like, I'm an outsider. But when someone asks you viscerally, like in the same way that you said, you're white, you have white skin. I was like, no, I don't. Right. And if you would have said to me, which is going to be ridiculous, I know, to some people, because they're like, you were the executive pastor at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and you're the senior pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Berkley. 100% I resonate and identify as an outsider. Mm. But I think there's power in that. Beautiful, clarifying, wonderful power. And so, I'm experiencing at First Pres Berkley. I have amazing women of color in our congregation who have been in the congregation for decades, who are rallying and encouraging and supporting me. And then clergy of color like you, a bunch of clergy around the Bay, the second they found out that I was hired, they were like, girl, we got you. Mm-hmm. We got your back. The support from my people came out in just in an unbelievable way.
Yeah. Mm. Mm. It's funny. It's like when I asked that question just now, I was like, oh, here she goes. She's about to say outsider. There's no doubt about it, right? Like, I knew the answer even though I asked it. But what's the difference, between an outsider and an insider in the church today? Yeah, in the PCUSA especially. That's the context that we're in. So Like, it, right? And,
Okay.
yeah.
So I feel like it goes back to our conversation that we were the part of our conversation we were talking about immigrant communities, like the Black church. And you have the Black church saying, don't take that away from us. Why are they saying that? Because it is a place where they are safe and accepted exactly like they are. No qualification, right? They can walk into a space and not feel other. They look around, they don't have to explain their sexual orientation. They don't have to explain their gender identity. They don't have to explain the color of their skin. They don't have to explain why their food smells this way, or why their eye shape is this way, or why they preach this way. For those who long for a safe community, because it's not every room they walk into, those are outsiders.
If you feel as if you have to explain why you're there all the time, then you're an outsider.
Yep. Not even all the time, even some of the time.
All the time. Yeah. Right. Yeah, but you're right. Even some of the time, right?
I mean, because that is the space that the church is in right now. I mean, there are people. I mean, that's the funny thing is I walk into a room and most people will think, oh, inside, like that's the title people will give to you. I mean, oftentimes, again, with the raceless identity of Asian Americans, the most common thing is like, oh, I don't see you like that. What is that?
What is that? Mm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, especially within the church, it's so much bigger than race. Because I know that there's even that question around orthodoxy, like, do I believe in God enough to be in this space? Now, that's not something you wear physically. No one would know when you walk into the door if you have doubts or if you're questioning something, but it does make you feel other, right? I think in terms of the work that the church can do, sometimes the easiest work that we can do is the stuff that's just like, again, changing the name of something, repainting the outside of the building. And race is like a huge important part of that because it's something that we wear on our person and walk around in. But I also know it extends beyond that in terms of insider and outsider culture within the church, which is just ridiculous because Jesus was 150% about smashing all of those barriers, right?
Right. Yeah. I think the realization that it's so easy to determine who outsiders and insiders are just is evidence of how much work is in front of us. Like, it shouldn't be this easy.
So I have a question from an Asian United Methodist pastor who's also serving at a predominantly white church. And he says he feels like an outsider from his denomination as well as the Asian community. Do you have the same feeling? 100%.
All day.
All the time. I'm not Asian enough for Asian communities. I'm not white enough for white communities. I studied abroad in Korea and I don't speak Korean. And so I would speak English to my friends on the street and I would get yelled at. People on the street yelling at me in Korean. I know enough that I could understand them saying, you're in Korea, speak Korean, right? Like you're not honoring your culture. And so absolutely, I feel like an outsider all the way around.
Do you get used to it? I do.
So you feel like an outsider in both communities. So you agree?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no doubt.
Say more.
I always go back to elementary school. The answers to questions of belonging were just like right in front of you. I would go to class be in school with like almost all white kids, the advanced academic programs, what they called AAP. So, but I mean, it's 4th grade or 5th grade or something like that. And I would go into the lunchroom, and I'm dark. Like summertime, I'll get dark as evening, so there's no question of like, skin color, that I'm a Black American. But I'd walk into the lunchroom and I didn't have a seat at the table with the white kids where I spent all day in classes with them, and we were in group projects and all that. Then I would go and I couldn't sit with the Black kids because even though the color of our skin matched, I wasn't accepted at that table.
Mhm.
And ever since, like, I still to this, I almost every single day, I think about the lunchroom
Oh, yeah.
at Han Middle School in Columbia, South Carolina. At some point, I probably need to just get past that visual image, and just like erase it from my mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, it still persists to this day where I'm like, all right, we will make our way through this. Me, I say we as if it's a corporate we or whatever, but yeah, I'll make it through this occasion in this room. My charge here is not to fit in or belong, but
Hmm.
is to maintain enough integrity that I don't bring shame to my family.
Oof.
So if I walk into a room and no matter who's in the room, right, I have stopped trying to figure out if I belong and how do I belong in this room, right? Will I be accepted or not accepted?
Right.
And now I try to get in and out without bringing shame to my family, maintain enough integrity about who I am that if my dad or my mom or one of my brothers or my ancestors, uncles, or my grandparents walked in, they could not accuse me of forgetting where I came from.
Oh my God. Like, okay. Sorry, I'm like speechless. That is so powerful and beautiful, and also speaks to the heartache and the suffering of racism, of being a person of color, that you have to wear that. You have to prepare yourself for that into a room, because there is the real possibility that shame is a real possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is the situation,
Yeah.
that you will be presented with a decision. Am I going to be treated this way? How am I going to let myself, am I going to respond in a way that denigrates the other person,
Mm-hmm.
that dehumanizes the other person? Am I going to allow the dehumanization of the things that you must have to navigate to have to create that as your own personal ethos is insane.
It's exhausting, but you know it is. I'm guessing you know it as well, right? It wears you out. You build up your endurance over time and you figure out the tricks, like how to get in and out, not give up too much of yourself and in such a way that you might get hurt, but give up enough of yourself that you'll bring honor to your family. It's a constant calculation you're making. It's just all the time. There's like a racial identity formula that you're running through your head. It's like an algorithm nonstop that's running all day long.
And yet,
And yet,
and yet, because I feel like those are the two most operative words of following Jesus Christ. And yet, like, this is the reality. And yet, because it is that calculation that protects yourself,
right.
right?
Yep.
Not, like you just said, not to give too much of yourself. And at the same time, Jesus calls us to give like
To be
eternally,
selfless.
abundantly, selflessly,
Right.
fully, right? Like to
Right.
hold those things in tension. So this beautiful question just came into the chat saying, is it an advantage to be an outsider in the church? And I would say, I'm really curious to hear your answer to this question. I would say 100%. First sermon series we did was reading all these beautiful stories and narratives on the margins. Those are easy to find.
Mm-hmm.
We just aren't reading them that much, but they're plentiful and in scripture. Scripture is about the outsider.
Mm-hmm.
We've just been talking about it so much on the inside that we forgot that. I mean, going back to the middle school lunchroom, I always say, like, we are forever our middle school versions of ourselves.
Right.
Like we are just walking around
I know.
our like pimply, awkward, braces wearing, insecure middle school versions of ourselves, right?
So true. Yeah.
And that's where we have compassion and forgiveness and grace for one another, is on the margins and not in the inside in a desperate attempt to keep power.
Uh-huh.
But there's more space if you're looking at a circle, there's a bigger space
Right.
out here.
Yes.
It's more life-giving and expansive. Like, come on in, folks, the water's warm. Like, jump outside. So do you think there's an advantage?
I agree with you. There definitely is. I mean, especially in reading scripture. I mean, reading and interpreting scripture. There's a perspective that you just read it differently. At the same time, I mean, this is what I wrestle with now is there's an oxymoronic reality that I live in every single day now, even as an outsider. Like I was called into a church that is 97% white or something like that, right? A denomination. Like I was actually called, I believe that.
Yeah.
I believe God called me in to like be a minister of the word and sacrament in the PCUSA. And even as I name my outsider identity as like central to who I am and something that I'm not ashamed of, I also, if I'm honest, I also have to be real about the fact that I'm an outsider with power now.
What do you do with that power?
Yeah. Please send me the book, the how-to book with that. But it is, it's a dynamic spot to be in. And when I say power, I don't mean it as in like, the power to destroy things, but the power to offer options. Like we have options in ways that, a lot of outsiders don't. Because of the institutions that we have been called to lead. So what do we do with that? Who are we to be in the midst of that?
So 20 years ago, a version of you and I would not be having this conversation.
No.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it says something, and this is also something that I kind of resent about this current moment. It says something that the church is desiring to call pastors of color into the pulpit, into positions of leadership, etc. There is the shadow side of that narrative, which is you got that call because you are a person of color, and the denomination is trying to diversify right now, right? I mean, I guess like a version of affirmative action or something like that. Who knows? What do you think is going on in the denomination, in the church, in 2021 that Amos Disasa has been called, 2 years ago now, the senior pastor at First Pres Dallas, and Charlene Han Powell is the senior pastor at First Pres Berkley. What does that tell us? What does that tell the world about the church?
There's a mysterious movement of God's Spirit at work.
Ooh, yeah, I like that. Okay.
That's it. I mean, I don't know how we went from point A to point B, but we're here right now. And I think the movement of God's Spirit is happening in people in more powerful and substantive and transformative ways than it is happening in the institution right now.
Okay. Yeah.
So I try to remember that I was called not to the idea of a church. I wasn't called to the vision of a future church. I wasn't called to a 160 now 65-year-old institution in the middle of Dallas. I was called to people.
Yeah. Yep.
That are praying right now. They're listening to a crucial conversation right now. They're people with hearts beating, and people that are they're dreaming big dreams.
Yeah.
For their own lives. People, and they're attempting to live in new ways, and they're not waiting for the church to give them permission. So yeah, I think there is a mysterious movement of God's Spirit. I will, and I'm not trying to understand it. I'm just trying to be with people. And there is safety in that, which is crazy because I just said I'm an outsider.
Yes.
Right?
Thank you for acknowledging the contradictory tension in that.
Yes.
And thank you for saying the thing about the people, because look, it humanizes our situation, not only in that we've been called to people, but that we are people. I mean, I think I didn't take this job because I wanted to be the senior pastor of a church. I didn't take this job because I wanted um, to break ground in this regard. I took this job because I fell in love with the PNC and then the congregation, and that momentum has only picked up. I'm like scrolling through these attendees and I'm seeing First Pres folks, and just like my heart is full. Like I see Ted and Beth and Steve and Shirley and Tim, and I mean just like all these folks. I'm like, everything you said, that is why we do this, right? It's like, don't other us even more by saying, oh, like, like, I mean, these are important things, like renaming a school. It's important for a church to acknowledge you are the first person of color we've ever put in this position. That's important. Mm-hmm. And also don't forget that when you cut us, we bleed, right? And that we love you with the same intensity that any other human being who is called to this, hopefully, God willing, has loved you before. I think that is just, thank you for saying that you've been called to the people.
Oh, yeah.
People of First Pres Dallas are very blessed to have you as a pastor called to them.
Yeah, they're beautiful people. And they have taught me so much in just a couple of years. So I'm looking forward to learning more from them. But what are you learning from your kids these days? What are they teaching you?
My children, my beautiful, beautiful girls, are teaching me how to be resourceful. They can find fun with just the two of them with the most ridiculous household items, like sponges or a laundry basket or something. And I'm not taking away from the immeasurable trauma and suffering that this pandemic has been, will continue to be. The isolation, the mental health fallout, current and future, the sheer loss of life, isolation, just all of that stuff. And at the same time, we are a generation with more resources than any other generation before, right? Like 10 years ago, Zoom wasn't a thing. Like this was not a thing. And so I think in the face of this, like my children are showing me how are we going to exist in the midst of it and rise above it and sit in it at the same time. I mean, like they haven't seen another kid in, months. And their response to that was to become each other's best friends.
They're paying such close attention these days too, right?
They are.
To everything we do. They're teaching us things, but they're also learning about us. We're spending so much time with them. I've eaten more meals with my kids.
I know.
In the last 12 months, I mean, we just sit around this table that I'm sitting at right now all the time. Just eat. And they're paying attention.
They are.
Yeah. Do you have any questions for me or that you'd like to present to both of us?
Yeah, I see a bunch that have come in. The article that I referred to earlier in the New York Times was written by Ezra Klein. There's some really beautiful comments that are coming in here, particularly about the powerful insider can live in a dream, cut off from reality, from understanding the outsider, the powerless. Outsiders are important counters to those blind spots. So Amos, you could very well indeed have been called.
Okay? Oh, 100% called. Yes. No doubt. Yeah.
The title of the article is California is Making Liberals Squirm. Yeah.
Well, what else is there? Anything else that we should be talking about while we're here?
I don't know. I am usually, and again, this is probably a cultural thing. I am used to being the one asking the questions. And so this was a new experience just to be like, oh, I get to answer some questions.
Mhm.
That was truly the hardest part of the call process for me, was being like, oh, I don't think that I have answers to these questions that they have. Turns out I did. Turns out I have lots of opinions on things. So I don't know. How can First Pres Berkeley be praying for First Pres Dallas?
That's a good question. We're uh, we're eager to well, we are prepared to be courageous and bold. And I serve a church that has always gone first.
That's awesome.
And we're not sometimes even when we have to be, pushed and pulled in the right direction, we still go, trusting God. So I pray that that strand of DNA, that's already a part of who we are, just persists, right? That it does not get clipped off and tossed. So pray for us in that way, that when called, we would continue to go first, if necessary, or to follow as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
To also have the humility to follow when necessary.
Yeah.
And the wisdom to know which one to do, right, in the moment.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that just sounded a little bit like the Serenity Prayer. I just realized that. So.
Well, it works, and I'm still seeing a bunch of First Pres Berkeley folks on here, so we will be holding that very sacred.
We'll do, yes. And for you, how can we be praying for you all?
These amazingly gracious, welcoming people got a new senior pastor in the midst of a pandemic. So talk about running the race, and just change is exhausting. So every change is a bit exhausting. And so amazingly beautiful community of resilient, seemingly inexhaustible, but probably exhaustible people are just, I think, stamina for just continuing forward. Stamina, courage, wisdom, as you said, because for all communities of faith, for all communities, we're all navigating how to do right by each other and who each other is.
Yeah. Right?
Is it just the people on the Zoom or in the sanctuary? Is it just the people around the block? I mean, who is our neighbor? And I think that's a really important question that First Pres Berkeley is continuing to honor and discern.
Will you close us in prayer?
I would be happy to. Thank you for having me, by the way. Thank you, First Pres Dallas. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the gift of friendship, for the people that you have put in our lives to draw us closer to you, whether it's a challenging new truth or comforting hope or just the ministry of presence. Right now, we kind of need all of those things, some in different measure than others, depending on our situations. But God, you know each and every one of our hearts. And so we trust the Spirit that called Amos to Dallas and myself to Berkeley, and all of these beautiful people to the communities in which they live in and lead in and serve. Help us to live these lives with courage, wisdom, and integrity. We pray this in the precious and holy saving name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Charlene, bless you. And thank you so much for being a part of our community this evening. It's been a real treat to, been a real treat to, well, we almost made it.
We did. Well, I almost got kicked out of the building.
So. I know. So yeah, well, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Yes. Good night.